I want you to imagine this moment. A US president announces that a second wave of military attacks, already planned, already expected, has been canceled. Not because of a peace treaty, not because of international law, but because oil infrastructure is back on the table and a handful of political prisoners have been released. This is not diplomacy as we once understood it. This is power negotiated in real time. I am Fareed Zakaria, and what you are watching unfold in Venezuela is not simply a regional crisis. It is a new operating system of American influence, where war is implied, not declared, where human rights become leverage, where oil quietly decides what peace looks like. If you want to understand how global power actually works today, not in speeches, but in mechanisms, stay with me. Because what happened when Trump canceled those strikes tells us far more than the strikes themselves ever could. And to see that clearly, we need to slow down for just a moment and define what this story is really about. Let's be precise about what we are actually witnessing. This is not a simple story of threats made and threats withdrawn. It is a story about conditional power. The United States did not abandon force. The Navy remains in place. The aircraft carrier remains off the coast. The option to strike has not disappeared. It has been paused, deliberately and publicly. At the same time, Washington moved quickly to assert control over Venezuela's most valuable asset, oil. Tankers were seized, sales were discussed, investment permissions were promised, but only under American supervision. You're dealing with us directly, Trump said. You're not dealing with Venezuela at all. That sentence matters because it tells us this is not regime change in the traditional sense. It is authority without occupation, influence without formal governance, a system where sovereignty is blurred but leverage is absolute. Political prisoners are released, some, not all. Diplomatic missions are discussed, but legitimacy remains unresolved. Cooperation is rewarded, resistance remains costly. And once we see that structure clearly, we can begin to ask a deeper question. How did we get here? Because this moment did not emerge overnight. To understand this moment, we have to step backward. Venezuela's crisis did not begin with Donald Trump, nor with Nicolás Maduro. It began with dependency, an economy built almost entirely on oil revenue, and a political system that used that revenue to substitute distribution for reform. For years, high oil prices masked structural weakness. When prices collapsed, the system hollowed out. Institutions weakened. Inflation exploded. Power concentrated. What followed was not sudden collapse, but slow erosion of legitimacy, of capacity, of trust. Into that vacuum stepped external pressure, sanctions, isolation, recognition battles, parallel governments. Each move narrowed Caracas's options while increasing Washington's leverage. By 2019, diplomacy had frozen. Embassies closed. Dialogue collapsed. Venezuela became less a sovereign actor and more a contested space, economically paralyzed, politically fragmented, internationally isolated. This is the background that makes Trump's current strategy intelligible. When institutions fail, power flows elsewhere. When legitimacy erodes, control becomes transactional. And once politics becomes transactional, crises are no longer accidents. They are tools. And that brings us to the first moment when this system truly revealed itself, when pressure turned into action and action into spectacle. It began quietly. Then, suddenly, it didn't. US forces moved in the Caribbean. An oil tanker was seized. Not just any tanker, but one flying a false flag. The Olena, taken near Trinidad, launched from the USS Gerald R. Ford. A message delivered without a speech. This was the first mini-crisis, because it was not merely an enforcement action. It was a demonstration, a reminder that control of oil flows is control of the state itself. And Washington was showing it could reach Venezuelan assets anywhere, anytime. Then came the escalation that never quite happened. A second wave of attacks planned, expected, discussed, was suddenly canceled. Not denied, canceled. The threat remained intact, hanging in the air. Why? Because Caracas responded. Prisoners were released, diplomats were received, oil cooperation was offered. This is the crucial insight. The crisis worked. If you're finding this unsettling, you should, because it reveals a model where military pressure creates political movement without a single bomb being dropped. If you want to understand how often this logic is now being used beyond Venezuela, stay with me. Because the real story is not the crisis itself, it's the system behind it. Behind these events lies a mechanism that is both simple and deeply consequential. Force is no longer the endpoint, it is the background condition. The United States does not need to invade Venezuela to shape its behavior. It only needs to make invasion plausible. Permanent presence replaces permanent war. Ships remain, options remain. Pressure never fully lifts. At the same time, economic access becomes the currency of obedience. Oil sales are not normalized, they are licensed. Investments are not free, they are selected. Security is not mutual. It is guaranteed by one side on its own terms. Notice what disappears in this system: negotiation between equals. Venezuela is not treated as a partner, nor even as an adversary in the classical sense. It is treated as a space to be managed, a problem to be stabilized, a resource to be organized. Human rights, in this context, become signals. Prisoners are released not to resolve injustice, but to unlock cooperation. Partial compliance produces partial relief. Full compliance remains undefined. This is power exercised through ambiguity. Nothing is fully promised. Nothing is fully withdrawn. And once this mechanism is in place, it does not stay contained, because systems like this generate their own momentum. They demand the next test, the next pressure point, the next crisis. And very soon, Venezuela was no longer the only country watching. The tension spilled outward. As pressure mounted on Venezuela, the signal was received far beyond Caracas. In Colombia, alarms went off. President Gustavo Petro spoke openly of fear that what happened to Maduro could happen to anyone who failed to align with certain interests, not as paranoia, but as precedent. Then came the second mini-crisis. Talk shifted from ships to land, from deterrence to action. Trump spoke of hitting cartels, of striking beyond borders, of forces that run Mexico. Colombia requested help against the ELN, a group once ideological, now deeply embedded in narcotics and cross-border violence. Suddenly, Venezuela was no longer a single case. It was a template. Joint operations were discussed. Military cooperation accelerated. The logic expanded. Instability anywhere in the region could justify pressure everywhere. Borders blurred. Sovereignty thinned. This is how systems escalate, not through declarations, but through normalization. What was unthinkable becomes discussable. What was temporary becomes reusable. And if you are a citizen living inside these states, this matters more than any speech. Because the costs of such systems are never paid by presidents or generals, they are paid by ordinary people. And that is where we must turn next. If you live inside the system, power feels very different. You are not thinking about aircraft carriers or oil contracts. You are thinking about whether a prison gate will open and stay open, whether a relative comes home today or disappears again tomorrow, whether security means stability or simply silence. For you, the release of political prisoners is not a gesture, it is hope. And that hope, in this model, is conditional. Some are freed, others remain. Orders are announced, then delayed. Officials claim ignorance. Bureaucracy becomes a second cell. Uncertainty does the rest. And here is the emotional truth. Leverage does not care who pays its price. When human rights become bargaining chips, justice is never complete. It is rationed, measured, reversible. If this story feels distant, it shouldn't. Because systems like this do not announce themselves as cruel. they present themselves as efficient. If you believe people matter more than mechanisms, pause here, share this, talk about it. Because public attention is often the only counterweight such systems respect. And to understand why this matters far beyond Venezuela, we have to widen the lens one final time before the future comes into view. When power is exercised this way, it never stays local. What happens in Venezuela now reverberates across the global system. Allies watch, rivals calculate, smaller states take notes. The lesson is not subtle. Sovereignty today is conditional, and resources determine how conditional it becomes. Energy markets feel it first. Oil once tied nations together through trade. Now it ties them through control. Access is mediated. Investment is filtered. Stability is granted, not negotiated. Diplomacy changes as well. Embassies reopen not as symbols of mutual recognition, but as instruments of supervision. Dialogue resumes without resolution. Legitimacy remains suspended indefinitely. And then there is the signal to the world. Force no longer needs justification. It only needs plausibility. If pressure produces results, restraint becomes strategy, not principle. This reshapes geopolitics quietly. No doctrine is announced. No red lines are drawn. Instead, ambiguity does the work. Everyone understands the rules without anyone stating them. The question is no longer whether this model works. The question is what kind of future it creates, because systems built on leverage always point forward to outcomes that feel inevitable, until suddenly they are not. And that leaves us with three paths ahead. The future of this system is not one outcome, but three, and each of them presents its own risks and its own promises. Scenario 1. The stabilizing future. This is the optimistic view. The system remains in place, but it works. Venezuela, under the weight of economic and diplomatic pressure, eventually opens up. A new generation of leaders rises, one that sees value in cooperation over confrontation. Oil, though still a commodity of control, becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. The country stabilizes. The U.S. gains a partner of sorts, but one that is still reliant on American oversight. In this scenario, the regional dynamics shift. The focus moves from military conflict to economic integration. Latin America, once a patchwork of competing ideologies, becomes a zone of managed stability where American influence is tempered by local governance and global cooperation. But it's fragile. The system still depends on unwavering American resolve and the willingness of other nations to comply. If that resolve wanes, so does the stability. Scenario 2, the fragmented future. This is the middle ground. Venezuela does not fully comply, and neither does the region. The system continues, but cracks begin to form. Political prisoners are released, but not all. The military remains a force of significant power. Oil becomes a battleground, not only between Venezuela and the US, but between rival factions of the Venezuelan state, as well as external actors China, Russia, Europe. In this future, we see an increasingly fragmented world. The Americas remain divided. The US stands as the largest power, but unable to fully shape the region. The pressure points become more frequent, more unpredictable. Venezuela becomes a contested space where each move by Washington is met with counteraction, not only from Caracas, but from other actors looking to undermine US influence. It is a world of strategic uncertainty, where every gain comes with a cost, and every victory a new battle to fight. Scenario 3, the escalating future. The darkest view. The system does not work. Venezuela falls deeper into authoritarianism. The US continues applying pressure, but rather than backing off, it escalates. A second wave of attacks does not remain on standby. It becomes a reality. Not just Venezuela, but the entire region becomes a flashpoint for conflict. Colombia, already involved in its own war on drugs, sees greater US intervention. Mexico's drug cartels grow bolder, and the US expands its operations there as well. The economic toll is immense. The humanitarian crisis deepens. Venezuela's oil becomes a symbol of lost potential rather than opportunity. In this future, there is no resolution, only deepening conflict. Power will be exercised not through quiet diplomacy, but through open confrontation. Borders will matter less, and alliances will be built on military strength, not trade or cooperation. These three futures all stem from the same system, the same logic, the same pressure points. But which one will emerge? It depends on choices that will be made not in boardrooms or congresses, but on the streets of Caracas, Bogota, and Washington, on the decks of ships in the Caribbean, and in the offices where deals are struck. This is the moment when we realize the future is written not in grand speeches, but in the quiet decisions we make today. And with that, let's consider one last question. What are we willing to accept as the price of stability? As we reach the end, we return to the heart of this story. What you've just seen unfold in Venezuela is not isolated. It's not an anomaly. This is how power works in the 21st century, quietly, strategically, and with far-reaching consequences. It's a future where force isn't always the immediate tool, but the ever-present possibility that shapes every negotiation. It's a future where oil isn't just a resource, it's leverage. The system we've described is one of calculated pressure, not permanent war. It is not the death of diplomacy, but its reinvention. It's a model where cooperation is exchanged for control and compliance is obtained through strategic intervention, not endless confrontation. But remember, every system like this has a limit. So, the question we must ask ourselves is simple. How long can this last? Because the future is not fixed. You have a voice in what comes next. If you want to shape that future, start by thinking beyond the headlines. Look beyond the immediate crisis. Share these ideas. Discuss the consequences. And most importantly, ask the questions that no one else is asking. What happens when diplomacy is used as leverage? What happens when a country is managed instead of governed? These are the questions that define the next phase of our global story. And we are all part of that story now. Thank you for joining me. This is Fareed Zakaria, and I look forward to seeing where this path leads us together. If you found this perspective valuable, don't wait. Share it with others. Start the conversation, because understanding these shifts today could determine the choices we face tomorrow.